Let's talk about the afterlife. When I say that, you probably picture one of two things, right? A good place and a bad place. Heaven and hell. But what if I told you the ancient Greeks, the folks who gave us democracy and philosophy, had a system that was way more complicated and, honestly, a whole lot weirder? Okay, let's get into it.
So, imagine you're just a regular person living in ancient Athens. What happens when you die? Where do you go? Well, I can tell you right now, the answer isn't a simple choice between eternal bliss and fiery damnation. It's not that black and white at all.
The Greek reality was, well, it was layered. Instead of just a good place and a bad place, they had this kind of neutral default setting where almost everybody went. Then there was an incredibly exclusive paradise, like a real VIP section, and a special punishment zone that was reserved for a tiny handful of people who really ticked off the gods. All right, so let's start with that default destination, because this is the big one. This is where the vast majority of souls would end up. It's a place called the Asphodel Meadows.
The Asphodel Meadows. It wasn't a reward, but it wasn't a punishment either. It was just the end. Think of it as this dark, gloomy, neutral zone in Hades' kingdom. It's less of a purposeful afterlife and more like a cosmic waiting room where nothing ever happens.
And this quote just nails it. The souls, or shades, they weren't really suffering, but they weren't really living either. They were basically in a state of eternal sleep, just kind of drifting around, mindless, with this deep, lingering regret for the vibrant, colorful lives they'd lost.
Okay, so what about the bad place? The Greek version of hell? That place would be Tartarus. But, and this is a big but, it came with a huge catch.
And this is so important to understand, because it's completely different from how we often think of hell. Tartarus wasn't for your average sinner. It wasn't for liars or thieves. No, it was an extremely exclusive club.
You didn't end up in Tartarus for just being a bad person. You ended up there for personally insulting a god, or trying to trick them, or directly challenging their power. It was like a divine prison for enemies of Olympus, not a jail for the general population.
And the punishments were so specific and personal. You've got Sisyphus, who tried to cheat death. Now he has to push a boulder uphill forever, only to watch it roll back down. There's Tantalus, who did the unthinkable and served the gods a horrifying meal. Now he's stuck in a pool of water with fruit overhead that he can never, ever reach. And Ixion, who had the audacity to lust after Hera, Zeus's wife, is now strapped to a spinning wheel of fire for all eternity. These are tailor-made tortures for cosmic-level crimes.
Now, on the flip side, we have the Greek idea of heaven, which was called Elysium. But because nothing is ever simple, it wasn't just one place. It actually had two totally different versions.
So originally, the top-tier paradise was the Islands of the Blessed. This was a literal place on Earth. This sunny, perfect island for demigods and massive heroes. We're talking Achilles-level famous. But later on, a different idea popped up. A nice, pleasant field inside the underworld for mortals who lived really, really good lives. So you had two different locations for two different kinds of worthy.
And that right there is a huge deal. The first version of paradise had nothing to do with being a good person. It was all about your resume, your status. You got in because you were born a hero, maybe the son of a god. Just being a decent, virtuous person, sorry, that wasn't enough to get you into the best afterlife.
But then, some new philosophical ideas started bubbling up, and they completely changed the game. Suddenly, there was a path, a way for a regular mortal to actually earn their way into that A-list hero's paradise.
And the key concept here was something called metempsychosis, which is a fancy way of saying reincarnation. The idea that your soul doesn't just go to one final place, but it's reborn into a new body to live another life. This basically created a system of upward mobility for your soul.
So how did it work? Well, according to the poet Pindar, it was a whole cycle you had to go through. First, you live a really pure and virtuous life. When you die, you get judged worthy and you get to go to that lesser paradise, the one underground. But then you get reincarnated to do it all over again.
And the magic number was 3. You had to prove yourself worthy not just once, not twice, but over 3 separate consecutive lifetimes of being an exceptionally good person. Only then could you finally break the cycle.
And after finishing that spiritual marathon, your soul was finally given the ultimate prize, a ticket to the Islands of the Blessed. You could leave the gloom of the underworld behind for good and go chill with Achilles and the other legendary heroes, having earned your spot, not by birth, but by pure, repeated effort.
So what are we left with?
A neutral default zone, a supermax prison for God offenders, an A-list paradise for heroes, a B-list paradise for good people, and a whole reincarnation system to get from one to the other. It's a lot to keep track of.
And here's the most important takeaway of all. There was never one single, official, universally accepted version of this. These ideas weren't written down in some holy book. They were concepts that different poets and philosophers played with and adapted over hundreds and hundreds of years.
As the classicist Radcliffe Edmonds puts it, it was all a common pool of traditional mythic motifs. That is the perfect description. Think of it like a big toolbox of ideas. A poet like Homer might grab the gloomy Hades tool, while a philosopher like Plato might use the reincarnation tool to build their own stories and explore their own questions.
And that's what's so fascinating. This messy, evolving collection of myths, it shows us that the Greeks themselves were wrestling with the biggest questions there are. What is justice? What really makes someone a hero? And what does it actually mean to live a good, worthy life? The afterlife was their canvas for trying to figure it all out.
So, I'll leave you with a question to chew on. We tend to think of paradise as a gift, right? Something given to you based on faith. But how does it change the way you look at your own life, your choices, your responsibilities, if you start to see paradise not as a gift, but as something you have to earn, again and again and again?